What seems like a romance story turns into tragedy. A Florida woman and her boyfriend moved in together for the first time. It was supposed to be an exciting time. Then police find a trail of blood.
I'm Elizabeth Millner with Law&Crime. It's something we see far too often, right? A boyfriend killing their girlfriend, or in some cases, a girlfriend killing their boyfriend. But in this case, the boyfriend is accused of killing his girlfriend just 2 weeks after moving in together.
Carlos Aldana and Yannelis Casales have been together for a pretty long time, 6 years. And Carlos was heading to Jacksonville to move in with her. And he did. Then about 2 weeks in, police got a call about a man suffering from a stabbing. Now, when they arrived to Carlos and Yannelis' apartment, a trail of blood led them to a horrific discovery. Yannelis was dead inside the apartment with multiple stab wounds. Sadly, there was no chance of saving her. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Now, I mentioned a man was suffering from stab wounds too. That man was Carlos, who had stab wounds to his leg and his arm. He was rushed to the hospital, but obviously that's not the end of the story. Now, 2 people were stabbed in an apartment. 1 person is dead, another injured. So what happened? The details of what led up to the stabbing haven't been released, really only labeling it as a domestic violence incident. But whatever did happen, it was enough for police to arrest Carlos for Yannelis' murder. And here's what we did learn. The couple were together for years, right? However, 3 of those years Carlos spent in prison in Cuba. He was living in the States under a visa when he moved in with Yannelis. Stabbing left Yannelis' loved ones, though, grieving. According to a GoFundMe page, she was the life of the party. Her friend Sydney wrote in the description, quote, "It is with sadness that I ask the community to please help in donating money for our beloved friend Yannelis Casales. Her life was tragically taken Sunday, March 30th. She was the life and soul of the parties. Her friends and family are devastated. We would like to use the money for her funeral expenses. We would truly appreciate all the help we could get." Now, as for Carlos, he's now been charged with second-degree murder.
I'm joined now by former Palm Beach County State Attorney and Managing Partner at Dave Ehrenberg Law, and that's Dave Ehrenberg himself. Dave, always great to see you, and thank you so much for being here today. Yannelis and Carlos were reportedly together for years, and yes, some of those years Carlos spent in prison, but what's your reaction to something like this happening after 2 weeks of living together?
It's a horrific situation, Elizabeth, and thanks for having me. And it happens in my home state, but this is the type of thing that happens too often in a domestic relationship when the defendant feels a loss of control. Something happens and he feels like he's losing her, and that's the way that these abusers lash out. Also, it didn't help here that he was fresh out of prison. So you're in a Cuban prison for a couple of years and you get out, and it's just not so easy just to go back to the United States, free living, the free state of Florida, and just pick up where you left off.
And police haven't shared a lot of details right now when it comes to this case, but we know it was a stabbing. Yannelis reportedly had multiple stab wounds to her body, and Carlos did too, to his arm and his leg. What do you think kind of happened there?
Yeah, it shows you this is a domestic incident, a crime of passion. There was probably an argument, then he got a knife and started stabbing her, and perhaps she fought back, and the knife hit him, it got into him. Now, I don't know. I read the reports. I don't know if she was armed at all with a knife herself. It looks like his knife wounds were just involved with just a chaotic situation where he's flailing around with a knife, stabbing her, and some of it got back on him, the knife perhaps while she was fighting back. It just shows you what a horrific, scary time that was in a household. And then, of course, the question is, was this purely a crime of passion that just happened on the spot, or was it premeditated?
Yeah, and I was going to ask, it was a very violent stabbing. I saw one video on Spanish language television online just about like the body cam, or at least the home surveillance footage, which just showed blood everywhere. Obviously, we can't show it here on our platform, but it just seems so gruesome, so violent. And I wanted to ask you, did you think part of it might have been premeditated?
Yes, but the prosecutors have not charged it as first-degree murder, which makes me believe that they think this was just some explosive moment where you had him reach for a knife and just attack her. They must have had an argument, and they must have thought it wasn't pre-planned. That just happened. And when you're a prosecutor, you have to make sure not to overcharge, because if you overcharge, you lose credibility with the jury. You only want to charge what you can prove, and you have to prove everything beyond a reasonable doubt. And I know that there are supporters of the victim who want this to be upgraded to first-degree murder, but you can get life in prison just with second-degree murder, the same as you can get with first-degree murder. The biggest difference is that second-degree murder does not allow for the death penalty. But in a case like this, where you have a domestic incident, it's rare for the death penalty to be imposed.
And being from Florida, being the former Palm Beach County State Attorney, obviously this case happened in Jacksonville, but when we talk about Florida as a whole and crime specifically, do you feel like you're seeing more crime across the state?
No, I haven't seen that. Florida gets a lot of attention, outsized attention, because we're Florida. It seems like we have the most bizarre cases and terribly violent cases. We have very loose gun laws, but this wasn't because of that. There was not a gun at play here. This was a person who was incarcerated in Cuba and then gets let out. And I guess the couple's expected to pick up where they left off. They'd only been living together for a couple weeks. So this was a combustible situation with someone who clearly isn't all there, because normal people don't commit crimes like this. Doesn't mean there's an insanity offense. It just means that you had someone very volatile who just got out of incarceration, where there's some really awful jails there in Cuba, comes to Florida and lives with the woman who was waiting for him after a few years. And then there's an argument and this tragedy ensues.
As a former prosecutor, do you find it more difficult to try cases that involve domestic violence, especially a case like this where you have a stabbing involved, lots of blood everywhere, and just a partner, a domestic partner type of crime? But do you find it more difficult to prosecute these types of cases as opposed to other cases?
Well, every case depends on its own facts. And here, you have a very bloody crime scene. You have so many stab wounds. That's really bad for the defendant. It shows a great deal of anger, a depraved mind. That's why they're charging it with murder, not manslaughter. They could have downgraded it to manslaughter, saying that he was in a heightened emotional state. Maybe they were just both arguing with each other and he picked up a knife. But they have charged him with homicide, second-degree murder, a depraved heart, and it's a number of stab wounds here and all that blood, and it's going to look bad for him. And I just think that this is the right charge, and I think this case is likely headed towards a guilty verdict.
And I was going to ask as well, too, do you think that this will result in a plea deal, but you seem confident that it'll go to trial?
Well, guilty verdict could be also a plea deal in advance. Just the fact is that the facts are bad for this defendant, and most cases end up in a settlement, so it's possible. But I can't imagine that the prosecutors are going to let him off without significant prison time. I mean, it may not be worth it for the defendant to cop a plea, because he's going to be facing decades in prison for this horrific murder.
And I want to ask you this. In international cases, there seems to be kind of a recognition of femicide. Now, obviously, we know that this case happened in Jacksonville, but I want to ask you, why isn't this something that we recognize here in the United States, especially when we see so many cases of women being murdered by men, probably because of their gender, but in terms of just recognition of femicide versus, other, how we classify this type of case, that being domestic violence sometimes. Why do you think that there's such a stark difference in the way that it's talked about outside of the United States?
Well, domestic violence is treated seriously here. There was a time period where, and it was around the 80s, where it was a grossly underreported, underprosecuted crime, where we had to do a PR campaign to let people know that silence is the enemy, that please speak up. And now you're seeing much higher rates of prosecution for these crimes. It's less underreported than it used to be. Now it's human trafficking that is in that same category where domestic violence was about 30, 40 years ago. Things have changed, though. And because of that, I think there has been justice. Now, sadly, when you have a basic domestic violence case, it is under-prosecuted in that the victim, after reporting it, is less likely to pursue it, because in about half of these cases, the victim, usually a woman, is fearful or for whatever reason does not want to cooperate with prosecutors. When there's a murder, though, when there's a death, that's different. And those cases, as you say, femicide, homicide, whatever you want to call it, that is treated really seriously. The rates of prosecution are high, the conviction rates are high, and justice is normally done.
And in terms of running a prosecutorial office, or prosecutor's office, I should say, do you feel like there's a lot of pressure from family members, especially when their loved ones are victims of these types of cases, to upgrade the charges? Do you feel like there's a lot of pressure for prosecutors to have to do that?
In all cases, we see that if the charge is something that is less than the families want, you will see pressure upon prosecutors. And we now have Marsy's Law in Florida, where prosecutors have to listen to the victims' families. They have a right to be heard, but ultimately the decision is in the prosecutor's hands. That's because we represent the state, not the victim. And there is a difference. And so we have to do justice based on the evidence and the law, not purely based on vengeance or what the family may think. Because if you charge first-degree murder in this case and the facts don't warrant it, you can lose the entire case. The professionals here are the prosecutors who are used to this kind of case and know that you have to charge appropriately. Now, perhaps facts will come out that show that this was a premeditated crime and would justify a first-degree murder charge. But if prosecutors don't believe they can get a conviction on that, they risk the entire case. They risk doing justice at all if they overcharge.
And in terms of what happens next in this case, what do you think will happen next?
Well, we've got more facts that will be revealed. There'll be discovery, and then there'll be some perhaps plea negotiations. But this case is not going to settle unless there are decades in prison for this individual. This is a bloody, horrific crime. And now, especially that it's made national news, there's going to be pressure on prosecutors to take this to trial. But I do believe that there will be justice here for the victim who didn't seem to do nothing to warrant this end. No one deserves this, but by all accounts, this victim was a very peaceful, kind person. She waited for this defendant for years to get out of prison. She welcomed him with open arms. This was her home, and this is how he repays her.
It's just an incredibly tragic and sad case overall, especially given that this started out like a love story and then it just turned just horribly, horribly wrong. Dave Ehrenberg, always great to have you on. Always appreciate it so much. Before we sign you off, though, anything else you'd like to add?
Now, I want to thank you for having me on. I'm now doing videos for Legal AF, which is on YouTube. It's part of the Midas Touch Network. We merged my Court Authorities channel with Legal AF, so I can see you there, and I'd love to see you here with you, Miss Elizabeth, next time.
Well, Legal AF, check it out on YouTube. Again, Dave Ehrenberg, thank you so, so much.
Thank you.
Online records show Caridad Aldana is still in custody at the Duval County Jail. Reporting for Law and Crime, I'm Elizabeth Millner.